Right. Well, thanks, Arthur. And once again, on behalf of the NUM, can we thank the people who have took part in this, and as far as we're concerned, our history and what it's cost in lives and illnesses and diseases is obviously of prime importance that it should never be forgotten in the coal mining industry. We've got a panel of 3 at this stage, hopefully 4 in a short time. The rep wasn't feeling very well and has popped out. But can I say also David McQuinney, who attended the thing we done in Strathclyde University. Davy, unfortunately, who's the person named as being a sufferer of COPD and pneumoconiosis, and bravely came along and spoke at the seminar we had, is actually unfit today, and obviously we've got to pay respects to him for volunteering his services, but couldn't make it along. Marette, as I said, is feeling slightly ill and has been out for some fresh air. Don't know if it's nerves about speaking here or something she ate at lunchtime, hope not, but she'll join us when she can. And on my left I've got Professor Ken Donaldson at the far left. He's Emeritus Professor of Respiratory Toxology at University of Edinburgh, and certainly in some of our contribution we'll realise how important people like Ken are and the whole issue of winning things, certainly in our point of view, for the miners, because without the real experts in it, as we'll hear maybe about the court cases we've had to take, then these things just wouldn't happen if we didn't have people like Ken along with us. And to my left's my good comrade Alec Bennett. Alec still sits and represents miners if they go to Medical Appeals Tribunals. So if they apply for industrial injuries and are turned down, Alec's one of the people we've got who takes the evidence forward and argues on the tribunal of the rights of the person. And I'm glad to say within the NUM in Scotland we certainly have a high success rate, because we do take cases, genuine cases forward, and I think we get respect because of that, Alec. Myself, I'm Nicky Wilson. I'm the President of the National Union of Mine Workers in the UK, and I'm the Scottish Secretary of the NUM here in Scotland. I've started in the coal mines myself in 1967, like Alec, he's a wee bit older than me, started before me. So hopefully between us we've got a wealth of knowledge about the working environment, about what happened, and certainly hopefully what happens in our communities as far as diseases and other things go. What I've got is a few bullet points to try and lead the debate, but please feel as we go along, if anyone wishes to raise an issue in any of the particular points here, just put your hand up and we'll bring you in on the discussion. And the first one for us 3 at this stage to talk about is just to tell everyone a little bit about our involvement in the disability and coal mining. So do you want to start, Ken, in the sense of that?
So I was involved because of my role in the Institute of Occupational Medicine starting in the early 70s when I went to work there. And we studied basically the relationship between exposure in the coal mines and to dust and the disease that was produced, because without some idea of what the relationship is between the amount of dust people breathe and the amount of disease they get, you can't really set a safe level in the pits. So the pneumoconiosis field research, which ran from the early 60s through right into the 80s virtually, and was aimed at trying to relate the amount of dust in the air in coal mines to the amount of disease. And it was a highly, a wonderful undertaking by the coal board to do this, because eventually they came up with a figure that they could regulate dust levels to in the pits that virtually eliminated lung disease. It didn't completely eliminate it, but in a large part, well, at least reduced it hugely. And that effort, which took about 20 years to do, was a massive undertaking by the coal board. And the final result it came to was something like 4 milligrams per metre cubed respirable dust in a return roadway. Was actually taken up all over the world, America, Japan, Germany, all over really. And because it was such a huge undertaking, no other country would want to do the same thing again. It was so expensive. You had to employ doctors, X-ray people, dust measurers, people like me, researchers, to try and get to that. And so my involvement really early on was at the level of trying to fix on a safe level in the coal mines. And thereafter I was also involved in research trying to understand what it was about coal mine dust that made it harmful. I'm a toxicologist, so it was my involvement afterwards.
Yeah. Thanks, Ken. And as I said earlier, people should realise the importance of people like Ken and their expertise, because he's quite right that Britain was to the fore, the United Kingdom, and bringing in legislation to prevent the diseases happening, which did happen in our coal mining industry, although it's reappeared in later years, but for different reasons, because of not the dust levels, but of the long-hour culture that was introduced after the miners' strike in '85 and that, when 12-hour shifts, 10-hour shifts started to become the norm again. Alec, do you want to...
Just to carry on, I appreciate the work that Ken does and his knowledge of the coal mining industry and the diseases. Just to carry on the theme of pneumoconiosis, because David McQuinney, who I dealt with his case, and we had to eventually go to a tribunal to establish that David suffered from the disease, because the medical profession was stating that he had sarcoidosis, and you'll probably have come across that, and it's nodules on the lungs, but there's no reason why what caused it. But Mr. Sudler, who sits in the tribunals, is very knowledgeable that Davy worked at this pit at the Lady Victoria, and there's a lot of research being done into pneumoconiosis within Scotland, and I think it was Kiswell way back in 1990 identified the high levels of people suffering from pneumoconiosis that worked in Lady Victoria College, and they set up a special X-ray unit in 1990 for employees of Lady Victoria to come and get an X-ray, and quite a lot of them were diagnosed at that time that had this. But I've noticed recently, and Marek, who may come in, but this person from Gorebridge, an old boys, tell us that he's got badly scarring on his lungs. Where did you work? He says, I finished up in Dawson Glen. He says, where did you work before that? I said, I worked with Lady Victoria. He says, absolutely, the balance of probabilities that you've got pneumoconiosis. Bennett put the claim in, I was still dealing with the appeal stage. Again, he's suffering from sarcoidosis. No mention pneumoconiosis or silicosis. So I sort of got feedback when we were at Glasgow, and it was I don't know whether it's new doctors or what, about industrial diseases, whether it's clued up with some of the older age care, I don't know. But it just seems a pattern that's now developed. And recently, in the last 2 or 3 years, and it's what amazes me is they're all ex-Lady Victoria men. And I know if we go to the tribunal, and it's the consultant that sits in the tribunal, he's aware, he's done all the research in it, and he's almost certain to say that if they worked in Lady Victoria, they were scamming the drugs. That they'll almost say it's pneumoconiosis or silicosis. But that is one of the problems. People, it's a long time for 1997 was when Upton Hall shut. Again, there was pneumoconiosis raised their head at Upton Hall because it was the peacock scene they were working, and it was the same scene that Lady Victoria worked years earlier. And there was quite a number of men, young men, machine men, etc., men who worked in the return areas that were, when Upton Hall shut, they were going out to Castle Bridge to get a job at the private companies. They were getting an X-ray, and they wouldn't take them on because they had pneumoconiosis, early stages. And at that time, there was no need to go to tribunals. They just got accepted that they suffered from the disease. And I've never had to go to tribunal with anything, but just recently, the last 2 or 3 years, they seem coming up with this sarcoidosis. And I can just add now that David McQuinney, we're still looking to take his case further, and he's now the medical profession have said he's not got sarcoidosis. It is definitely silicosis that he's got, and that's his problem, and COPD. And I think I tell you, the sage in Glasgow, you need 20 years underground to claim it. David's got 19 years, 265 days because they turn off the year strike, and we can't get round that because there's a commissioner's decision in it. But anybody with any questions, I can add.
Yeah. I think, Ken, you touched on a thing that interested certainly ourselves at Glasgow when you said that young people coming up through education, medical education now are not getting into your field so much.
No, it's true.
Which was a worry
Yeah.
for people like us then.
Occupational medicine, I think, is in a terrible state of decline in the UK, so it's not attracting young doctors into it as a discipline. So I think what you said was absolutely right. There'll come a point where the doctors won't have seen something like silicosis and pneumoconiosis, at least to the extent that was common, say, hitherto, just because it was a coal mining industry and so on. There was a mining industry and various sorts of things. And I mean, there's not being able to do anything about this, but I would think there's something like 8 to 10 consultancies or heads of departmentships available at the moment in occupational medicine, and they're free because nobody wants to take them on. And young people won't go into it because it's not sexy, it's not considered to be cutting edge in medicine now. So, I mean, it's really hard to see what can be done about that, really.
Yeah, it's a worry. Yeah. Anyone want to join this part? Yeah?
I just had a question about I think it's 30 years exposure to be, to be diagnosed as having silicosis. But for mines like Lady Vic, where there's a particular type of more toxic coal, is there any acceptance that perhaps you might need less time?
There's no time limit for pneumoconiosis or silicosis. One of the boys that actually worked in law, there was two, I can't believe Rob Wilson here, there was two Jimmy Martins, and one got quite surgery because he'd just come out the army and he went in and left him off. And he was only 3 years. 3 years in the peacock sea when he was diagnosed with pneumoconiosis. So there's no, you can get it. There's no restricting either surface workers. I've come across silicosis with stonemasons, etc. And so, because pneumoconiosis is only caused by coal dust. And I've heard that tribunal chairman saying it's caused by smoke in it. It's nonsense. And I'm not a doctor. But there's no time limit for claim pneumoconiosis or silicosis. But with COPD, you must have 20 years underground in a coal mine. And it was interesting when we finished through Glasgow, he was one of the junior doctors. He said, because the boy we were talking about was no here today, David McClunny. David was a sportsman, he played junior football, he was never smoked in his life. And he says when the lung function testing, they don't take into account of coming from a sporting background with more volume in their lungs. I says, no, they didn't take nothing like that. It's just, doesn't matter what you were before. It's just, you must have that litre drop in lung function, and you must have 20 years underground in a coal mine. That's the criteria. If you didn't match that criteria, then you can't get it. And there's one boy, Nicky, when we started this off, I'm going to be back to 1997 in Edinburgh Club, along with Thompson Solicitors. And one boy worked at Lady Victoria, Wilson Glen. He had 19 years, 6 months underground, but it was the coal board doctor that advised that he goes to the surface because he suffered from chronic bronchitis and emphysema. And he could claim the civil claim against the employer, but he couldn't claim the DHSS because it's still the same criteria. Yet you have to have 20 years underground, and before that you had to be accompanied by pneumoconiosis. So you really had to be, and it was a 96% failure rate. And then they addressed it, they took it to pneumoconiosis bit, and just went to the criteria as 20 years underground and a little drop in lung function. But for silicosis and pneumoconiosis, there's no time limit.
No, you can do it. I mean, as far as the union's concerned, we have challenged the 20-year in COPD at least 3 occasions with the IAC, which is the board that advises the government. We've been unsuccessful in getting the 20 years down because the medical experts' advice they've got says 20 years is a reasonable figure.
Well, the problem was, of course, that the COPD is also caused by smoking, so it's a really difficult one to untangle. I mean, coal dust exposure does cause COPD, but in someone who smokes and works in a pit, it's really difficult to untangle the relative roles. Yeah. And historically, I guess that's why they said 20 years underground.
Yeah.
At least things have had some dust exposure, but it seems totally arbitrary to me. And it wouldn't be anything that would be tied to actual disease. It's just a figure that has been plucked from the air, and that's never a good thing.
No, but they use that in all diseases. Anyone? Sorry? Yeah?
Are there any statistics available to show how many cases are still going through tribunals, say in a year?
It's certainly not. The facts are that we're now getting more pneumoconiosis. It's actually risen. And the reason for that is, as Ken says, because of what happened with dust and the stuff that was brought forward, dust suppression methods in the coal mines, and starting in the 60s, 70s, it sort of went out of it. But then we discover, when the long hour culture came in after the miners' strike in '85, when they cut back the workforce, instead of having an 8-hour shift or 7 quarter hours underground, men were working 12-hour shifts. And that meant that although the dust levels were lower, they were exposed for longer, and therefore it is starting to reappear. Not obviously, as we've not got as big an industry as we had years ago, but it's apparently it is on the increase again, and there's more coming through at this stage. It's not in a large scale.
Longannet complex in particular?
No, it's we first got it in Longannet actually back in the 1990s. It first appeared there, Miles, and relatively young guy. We had one guy at 41, I think. Alec was. He was the youngest one, and that's when it came out about the long hour culture, and we argued and started cutting back the hours that men were working there. And in the last few years, they've actually changed the way they measure dust underground. It used to be, it was never a great method, but they sort of hung a machine in a roadway, and it measured the dust coming out. But although that did give them samples, if you were in a particular part 100 yards away from that, you could be in a very dusty area, and by the time it starts to come out, the dust would settle, it wouldn't be as bad, And they've now got a method of personal samplers, that the individual person now wears a personal sampler. And if the dust level goes above a certain measurement within a period of time, then they have got to, curtail their work in those dusty areas. So it's moved on a step. It took a number of years to do that. But I would say, arguably, we're probably the best in the world now about that with the personal sample situation. I think they're introducing them in North America. So there are things happening all the time. But it's not in a large scale, but I suppose if you prorate it with the number of miners we had back in the 80s and that, it is a problem arising again. Second kind of point is, this is probably more for me and Alec in a sense, what were the community attitudes towards disability? Did these change? Was there a stigma associated with disability? And I think we kind of touched on that earlier when somebody, I think it was Arthur, when he was doing his presentation, and it was quite interesting when he put up stuff for Davy Guy, who unfortunately passed away recently. He was my counterpart in the North East, and the Durham miners, saying about exactly what we'd said, that disability in the pits, ever since I began, and I'm sure Ali will agree with this, is we had an industry where the miner started at the bottom as far as wages go. When you went into the pit as a young person, you were on the lowest wage scale, you worked your way up. If you were a coalface worker or driving the tunnels and that, you get the highest wages. But then if your health started to deteriorate because of the fact you were working these hard conditions, you started to come down the ladder again, because we never attained wage protection, despite arguing for it for years in our industry. Therefore, the attitude of the miners, in my experience, always has been that disability in that sense was never a stigma. It was a protection, that the miners would rally round. And if a man that you were working with wasn't fit because he'd spent years in the pit and couldn't do his job properly, then the others mucked in and done a bit extra to ensure that he didn't lose his wages, which meant his family would suffer and all the rest of it. And I think that spins off into the communities, that if you had men maimed in the pit, loss of eyes, limbs, everything, it was never a stigma in the mining communities. There was a respect that you got that through your work. So I've never seen any stigma about it in our communities, certainly. Don't know about you, Alec.
No. If you go back a few years ago, before 1990, if you had an accident or an industrial disease, I think it was 86 when they changed the criteria to get any benefits, you had to have 14%, and that's still the case yet. If your disability doesn't come to 14%, you didn't get a pension from the government. But at that time, you had what they cried a reduced earnings allowance. So if you were, for instance, with a face worker and you had to go to a lighter job, if the disease or accident was before 1990, you got what they cried reduced earnings allowance. Now, it used to be special hardship allowance. But the reduced earnings allowance, they scrapped it in 1990, but we're still getting it today for people that work in Lady Victoria with pneumoconiosis. If they're discovering they've got pneumoconiosis, then as soon as you mention a Lady Victoria, they say, well, it must have happened when they worked in the lady. So they're giving them a date of onset in 1980 or 1981, which is before 1990, and they therefore also qualify for reduced earnings allowance. But the only bitterness you get for some of the people who've been diagnosed with, and it's people who worked in all private or long manner, because they worked in the coal industry after 1990, they can't qualify for reduced earnings allowance. And the rates now is about £66 a week, so it's quite a lot of money. So I can one of the boys that's around the real retired, he's got 8%, he gets about £15 a week, and somebody else has got 1%, but because it was before 1990, they get £66 and add the £50 on top of it. And that's the law, and there's no way around that.
Yeah. Ken, you okay with that? Yeah. The next point is, were there any significant support networks for disabled minors? Well, I think the unofficial one we spoke about was that you were looked after if you were disabled underground, and rather than see men losing their wages, going into a lesser paid job, where it was possible, that unofficial thing did take place and individuals were looked after and supported. But Marette's not here just now, but I can say in my experience, not now but in recent past, that KISWO, the Coal Industry Social Welfare Organisation, used to have quite a substantial network of things where they assisted disabled minors. They like bowling tournaments, sports tournaments, they took them trips, they had a Christmas trip, Christmas day out, they had a summer day out. Unfortunately, with the demise of the industry, things like that have disappeared. And it's, as somebody said earlier, I think it was Rob Wilson when he was speaking, he says, as the industry goes, it's not just the jobs and that, the whole structure changes, even culturally. He was on about, we're brass bands, we're pipe bands, every colliery supported, paid money off their wages to support, all that network goes. And it does have a whole effect across communities, disclosures. But certainly in my view, within the communities as well, I would argue that people would help where they could. If you had an old miner that had their concessionary coal but weren't fit to carry their coal in, clean their fire, all those things happen. Not in an official way in the communities, but that's the way people looked after each other. But there was at one time, I think, KISWO had done a good job, but they've obviously not got the staff now to do that anymore, which I always thought was a loss, because people did look forward to that in a way. And I think they do, and we still have area welfare committees that have some money to help out, and we still, where if a person needs a wheelchair or something put in that the local authorities can't do, then there still is assistance for that. Not in a big scale, because we're not a big industry now as such, and we don't have the money, but where we can, we still help with those type of things. You want to add that?
The last time I had a discussion with Marette, KISWO's now got a database with ex-miners that they represent. But they don't just represent ex-miners, they represent mining communities. So there's people within the communities, and especially widows, that they'll go in and visit. And one of the payments they're getting for quite a lot of people is attendance allowance. And that's for people over ages 65. That's the boy I was talking about, the old boy, who had the scarring on the lungs and the stained sarcoidosis, they wasn't claiming for attendance allowance because they think because they've got their pension and they're quite comfortable, but they're having to pay somebody to cut their grass, they're having to pay somebody to decorate, they're having to pay somebody this, and that's entitlement for attendance allowance. So when I was saying there's about 7,000 in the database in Scotland, and funny enough, the biggest area is the Lothians, probably because the two big pits was Burton and Wilson Way that close, so there was kind of at the time of the strike, Nicky, that was a big employer in the Lothians. I worked to between 5 and Green Park, 5,000 or 6,000 jobs went when they shut the two pits. So they actually took on another welfare officer to deal with Ayrshire. Joyce Anston, who deals with Ayrshire, and Marette, and I can't remember what's his name, Belson, they deal with Larts, fine. And they still do a fantastic job within the community's own welfare.
Yeah. It might just worth be saying as well that in terms of, well, one question you might ask was how does your average coal miner know that they've got pneumoconiosis or lung disease? Well, the whole idea of prevention in medicine is that you don't wait till they actually get frankly ill, but you have some kind of way of detecting markers. And one consequence of the pneumoconiosis field research was that miners got regular x-rays and regular lung function tests, so that when the lung function started to decline, or some very small lesions appeared on the x-rays that wouldn't actually impair their ability to do their job, it could be detected and flagged up, and then perhaps, and I'm not sure whether there was a mechanism in place to change what they did and their job to try and ensure they had less dust exposure. That might all, ironically enough, I guess that wouldn't always be popular with the mine, but at least the coal board in itself had some kind of had a strong commitment towards. It makes me sound like I'm a representative of the coal board. I'm just telling you the way it was. The coal board was very responsible in the sense that it did monitor people's health, and so you could intervene if the disease was spotted early, and it was spotted early. Many miners got lung disease and then it didn't progress any further because they were getting further exposure.
Yeah.
Just to add on that, just going back a few years ago, if the lung disease was severe enough, Ken, that the coal board would recognise it, the doctor would recommend early retirement, and it did click in at that time, their pension. Not at a reduced rate, they got their pension at the full rate because they were suffering from an industry-related disease.
And that was the importance, I think, of what Alec was relating to, what was special hardship allowance became reduced earnings allowance up to the done away with it. The government stopped it in 1990. That, as Ken says, if an x-ray showed a miner was beginning to get early signs of dust retention, then they could be moved to another job. But at least with reduced earnings allowance, special hardship, they had a bit of an offset in the wages they lost. But unfortunately that went away, and to be quite honest, the fact of life is men were loath to do it then because they had to earn money to keep their families and that's the problem when you take out these things.
It's a hard industry where as you're longer in it, you start to earn less. I mean, that's almost the opposite of what happens in any other job, isn't it? In fact, the longer you're in the job, the more you make. So it
went the other way. Okay, I'm conscious of the time and we are running a wee bit late, but one of the things here is how contested was the medical knowledge about chronic conditions, COPD, etc., and what role did the medicine play in it? Securing better conditions compensation, could gaining diagnosis be challenging? And that's, as I said earlier, where people like Ken come in. I mean, in our experience, when we fought the COPD case, people don't realise it took 8 years through the courts, and sometimes you get politicians claiming that they gave the miners this, they agreed to it. It's just not true. You know, everything the miners have ever got, white finger, vibration white finger, deafness, has been gained through litigation, through court cases. That's the facts of life. And as I say, it took 8 years for the initial cases in the COPD before we got a decision. And one of the things, as Ken will know and maybe speak a wee bit about, that in both sides you've got experts, and they are so important in this because I think it was Dr Rudd that led for us. I don't know if you know him, Ken. He led from the union side, but the coal board, if you like, government also had their experts. So medical knowledge and argumentation is so important in winning a compensation case through the courts. And I know that from experience. We've recently lost the case, the Scottish miners anyway, for osteoarthritis of the knees, which was run through the courts. And it was lost in a technicality because the medical case and everything else was good, but the judge used what he called jurisdiction, his personal jurisdiction, to rule that the case should be time barred based on the decision of if you remember the atomic Christmas Island people. They lost their case, and the judge used a jurisdiction to say, well, I don't think there's enough people left that could supply the evidence to show that osteoarthritis in the knees was caused or could be proven. And it was a perverse decision. And when the union went to the appeal court, we weren't appealing against the medical facts or anything else. We were appealing against whether that judge had correctly used his jurisdiction. And unfortunately, the appeal court said no matter the merits of the case, a judge has the right to use jurisdiction. And that's why we lost that, much to the cost of, I can say, the miners' union in Scotland. But the good thing about things like that, and this is where medical evidence, I'll let Ken in now, but is so important because of the years fighting for osteoarthritis of the knees. All the medical evidence that was brought forward made IAC, the body that looks at industrial diseases, re-look at. They turned it down in 1993, I think, as an industrial disease. But because of the court case and the medical facts that came forward, they re-looked at it. And we now have osteoarthritis of the knee as a recognised industrial disease for miners throughout the United Kingdom, which has meant literally thousands of miners have been given a percentage disablement for that, which in some cases meant more money as a weekly pension, and some, for the first time, a weekly pension. So it wasn't all doom and gloom. And it, as I say, Ken, it's so important, you'll know, how medical evidence is taken, and obviously some of the colleagues disagree in the facts.
Yeah, I guess one thing, because it was very difficult to reflect on that kind of thing, because it's highly technical, and I'm not really, to be honest, I'm not all that informed on the exact cases, the case law on that. But it'd be nice to think that science was very clear cut, and the medical evidence is always very clear. It's not. Science is a work in progress, and our understanding of disease and what causes it is different today than it was 10 years ago, and 20 years ago, and 30 years ago. The complication with bronchitis, and I think that's the main issue here, I think nobody ever really argued very much that coal workers' pneumoconiosis was caused by coal dust in lungs, coal mine dust in lungs. The complication was the smoking, is my understanding, and that for a long time, rightly or wrongly, the coal board and its lawyers argued that because so many miners smoked, and the predominance of miners did smoke, that you couldn't untangle COPD caused by cigarette smoke from COPD caused by dust in the air, and that argument echoed on for years and years. And it wasn't until you had some data, I think, that finally came out, I think, maybe towards the end of the whole business that kind of swung it, showing that even miners who didn't smoke, there weren't very many, but even miners who didn't smoke did develop a kind of bronchitis, which is what COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, is. It's bronchitis plus emphysema. But let's think about it in terms of bronchitis, spitting and coughing mucus 2 or 3 times a year. Or more often, probably in the case of a coal miner. But that, as my understanding, was really the problem of smoking, was what really confounded that whole proof of what caused it. I mean, I'm willing to be told differently to that, but that's my understanding.
No, you're right. I mean, the ironic thing is, believe it or not, that the industrial disease, chronic bronchitis emphysema, for miners, does not take into account smoking whatsoever. The IAC version, which But
Yeah.
Ken's right, so much argument was based on smoking and not smoking. And if a minor was a smoker, he lost a heavy smoker, he lost a large chunk of his compensation if he had COPD because of that, and that had to be conceded, I think, from our side as well. But, I mean, Alec, I don't know if you want to say anything, but it is so important, and we, as a union, certainly have relied on medical experts over the years, because we're trade union people who fight on behalf of the workers and we're members, but we're certainly not experts, and the solicitors we use and others rely so heavily on medical expertise to support their cases. Without that, we wouldn't get anywhere, and it's good that, you know, we get to know, shall we say, people who will be, if they can, shall I say, friendlier to us than the other side, but that happens in both ways. But the point is, without that, then we wouldn't get anywhere. So it is important to have people like that who
I think
have the
it's important that what you
expertise.
say is exactly right. That it's very easy on the basis of scientific information to come at it from two ways. It happens all the time in the course. Expert witnesses are brought from one side and expert witnesses are brought from the other side, and they look at the same data and they come to different conclusions as to what's going on in the background behind it. And so I think that's reasonable that people who aren't scientists should kind of scratch their heads and say, well, why is that? Because it's science, isn't it? It should just be true, in inverted commas. It's not. I mean, all science has got through difficulty, especially if you study a large population of people. You get all sorts of noise and just variability, because no two people are the same, and it's very difficult to draw general conclusions from that kind of data. So it's just the nature of the world.
Yeah, I understand. Alec, do you want to relate to your medical appeal stuff? Because you, I think, could give a version of medical people that sit in that, and some of the problems we've got with that, to be fair.
Just before I go, I'll touch on that, but it was interesting that pneumoconiosis, I think it's been a prescribed disease for way back 1948 when the welfare state was set up. But the Benefits Agency used to put a criteria on it that you had to have category 2 before you could qualify for any percentage award, disability. And it was the late McLennan who didn't work at ADA, and he says, I can't find none in the regulations that says you've got to have a certified degree. And we challenged the Department of Work and Pensions, and the case went to Commissioner May, and he come down on the side of the union. And there's nothing in the legislation that said you had to have a certified degree. And he took a lot of evidence, Ken, from the International Labour Organisation, which is a worldwide organisation, and his findings was, with pneumoconiosis, you've either got it or you've not got it. So anybody that's got a diagnosis, and what happened was they then had to concede that was the case. If you had previously applied, a lot of men from Newton Grange, a lot of ex-Ladymen had applied, and were turned down because you didn't have the satisfactory criteria. You go back date to the Commissioner's decision in 1993. And that was a success, and that was a legal brain and medicine also. But I found, certainly if I was going to a tribunal with a pneumoconiosis appeal, I would insist that there was a consultant, a respiratory consultant on the panel, and that's the history. That's always been in the past. Mr. Sudlaw, Mr. Barton, I can name them off.
Yeah.
But there's now, you're not guaranteed to get a respiratory expert on the tribunal. And I've always insisted, and I've got adjournments to make sure that somebody's there, because that knowledge, because now they don't look at x-rays, it's on a disc now, Ken used to put up the x-rays to tell where it was, here's the nodules, that's it there. Now it's on a disc. And medical evidence is invaluable. I like to hear a case kind of watertight before I go. That's why the union is respected, that we don't just go to tribunals with hopeless cases. If need be, the people that we're going with, especially when it comes to respiratory, try that we get a letter from the Rain consultant at the Royal Infirmary or wherever they're attending, and that usually sways the balance in favour. So medical opinion is very, very important.
Yeah, Ken? Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
My name's Bob Mackenzie. I worked for 25 years in the wine industry as a quality electrician. Started at this pit when I was 13-year-old. I've got what could be termed the new industrial type disease. I've got chronic myeloid leukemia caused by working with radiation and industrial chemicals. I've had it for 8 years. I was diagnosed in 2005, and I have worked with radiation, and I have worked with benzene, the chemicals. And also, in the mid-80s, I worked up at a big mine up in the Mongolian-Siberian border in Chernobyl. So anyway, this industrial condition is an industrial type leukemia. Through David Hamilton, IUM, which have given me a lot of help in the past, through Thompson solicitors, I had a look at the case, the medical evidence and proving it. The British government only accepts it as an industrial disease if you worked in the nuclear power industry. You know? So basically, I had a lot of help from the West in general and the consultants and all that, but they did tell me it was very difficult to prove. And at the end of the day, although it's a sort of new industrial type disease, although this is a diagnosis and it's formally put out in print, you know, that, and that, you know, it's caused by benzene, which I've worked with, it's caused by radiation, which I've worked with, but it can't be proved.
It's particularly associated with the shale oil industry as well. The benzene issue.
I used benzene in that workshop across here when I was 16-year-old.
Cleaning stuff, I know. No, but that, I think it's a good point, Dave, in the sense that, and it leads us on to another question about the role that the unions played in fighting for this. And, you know, over the years, I mean, I remember when we won the COPD, people said, well, that will be the last one, you'll never win another one. But then osteoarthritis in the knees came up, and as I say, we lost the compensation case and the technicality, in my view, but we did win the right of miners to have it as an industrial disease. And for years, as people know who worked in the industry, if you went with knee problems, which is very, very common in miners, and remember, you have got to prove to IAC that you have at least, in a similar, if coal mining has to get it, they look at other similar industries, and I think you have to at least a 2 to 1 chance more of having it in order to get it accepted as an industrial disease. And people went along to their doctor suffering from knees and all that, and it was wear and tear, wear and tear. Well, we always knew it was wear and tear, but the wear and tear was caused by the industry we worked in. And even now, when we say there'll not be anything else, I mean, one of my things is always about neck injuries, you know, I'm trying to think of the name of it, spondylitis and things like that. Now, I would say it's very, very common in miners, that because of the fact you're walking down, you're banging your head, you're doing this, lifting things in awkward position. So there's still things to be done, but the unfortunate fact of life is, because again of the demise of our industry, how small our union is now compared to what it was, will we ever be able to take cases like that on again? And that is a big question mark. That is also a big loss to people out there that could be suffering for these diseases that we might never prove. There was one that came out recently, and it was fought in South Wales. It was for not underground workers, but men who worked in the coke works. And they've now got accepted that stomach cancers and that can be caused by the chemicals in coke work. So there's a progression all the time, and it's always important never to say never, because if the medical experts, the unions are involved to look at this, come out and say, look, this is beginning to look as if there is a link there and that. It can happen. But for the bulk of it, I would say we've done a lot of it, but whether we'll ever be able to achieve anything else, I really don't know now. Yep.
Coal mining is still a major. I mean, do you strong links with that to get evidence out, taking things forward, or get your expertise through?
Yeah, we've always been proud of our international links in the NUM, and I mean, we've recently been working with the South African NUM, because I don't know if they were trying to they're taking a case out for silicosis for South African miners, not just in coal mine, against Anglo-American, which is a UK-owned company. And what they were trying to do, because they've been hitting their head off a brick wall in South Africa, they brought it to London to argue that it was a British-based company, and therefore the case should be heard in the UK courts, because probably they would win it if it was heard here because of the evidence and that. So far that's been unsuccessful. So we do share a lot. We've got the Ukrainian miners coming over, and if they get over, and the 7th of July, we've got an interchange with them for the last 6 years. We've been in India, I've been in India visiting them. And it is important, because I think Ken said that right at the beginning, that the research that was done away back here in pneumoconiosis and dust in the mines is used worldwide. That's a marker that people use. Yeah.
It's interesting when you say about America, because America, just over the last, I would say maybe 5 years, has seen an outbreak of co-workers pneumoconiosis or silicosis. Silicosis is a different disease. No, I think, well, in their case, they think that it's the compliance with the standard, because it's very focused in some places, in some states, and they think that the compliance of how tight they've managed to keep the dust levels to what the regulations are, which in America is run by NIOSH, National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, and here is run by the HSE. They have a standard which is very close, similar to ours, slightly less. But there's a general belief that in some of these mines this has not been complied with either, and either kept quiet, or because there's no data. I've not seen any data, but there's a strong kind of hint going around amongst the medics that, which are the people that I've seen that who write these articles and so on, that the explanation is very likely that the dust levels are higher than they think they were. So it's kind of going back to the old days when the exposures were high. In America, yeah. But they're still under NIOSH, supposedly.
Yeah.
Which is interesting in South Africa, of course, in the gold mines, the government there has no role whatsoever in regulation and compliance. So companies say, well, we're keeping it down to 0.1 of a milligram or whatever it is for quartz, and nobody knows if that's true. And most people, because of the history of occupational disease, which makes an edifying reading, you think, yeah, well, no, there should be some outside body overseeing this, and there isn't in South Africa. So I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if their exposures are very high.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
Very difficult.
you don't hear very much, do you?
No,
That's the trouble. But they've got huge
We've
numbers.
not got any exchanges with Chinese trade unions at this stage. Although, in fairness,
Do they have trade unions?
John Prescott was, well, they have to, supposedly. But John Prescott was involved in setting up some to and fro information to the Chinese mining industry. Whether that's continuing, I don't know now. But difficult in China, as I understand it, a little I know, is that you've got 3 sets of mines. You've got government-owned mines, state-run mines, you've got a local authority, believe it or not, run mines, and then you've got the unofficial mines. And you usually find when it's a disaster, it's mostly an unofficial, and that's the sadness of it.
Can I make a Farage moment and ask if Europe is of any use at all? Because obviously there's a big coal mining community and steel community. Does the European Union help at all in terms of data?
Yeah, it can be, but one of the problems, I was saying this to somebody earlier, that we are, at the present time, the union, the government, this present government are doing this cutting red tape exercise. And what they're doing just now is, in our opinion, ripping up large pieces of the mining legislation. And as a union, we've had a number of meetings. We've got one in a couple of weeks again with the HSE. And we are totally opposed to some of the stuff they're doing. They're talking about not having a mines rescue service. They're talking about that instead of the government inspectorate being, if someone, for example, wants to open up a part of a coal mine as a new development, they've got to show all the plans to the inspectorate, who then say, okay, or we're not happy with that. They're now saying, no, that we don't need to do that. That'll be the responsibility of the owner. And if the owner doesn't comply with it, we'll prosecute them. We're saying, all right, but what if there's 10 men killed because of that? You know, it's all right saying you'll prosecute an owner, but that doesn't help the 10 men who meanwhile lost their life for something. And to let people understand the importance of this is that a lot of mining legislation has came about, unfortunately, because of disasters over the years. And it takes something like that to change the legislation. And as a union, we're saying quite clearly to the inspector, and so some inspectors who have now gone, because we've got one advising us in it, and he's saying, in his opinion, they're selling the jerseys. And it's all right saying cut red tape and all that, but when men's lives are at stake, you can't do that, afraid. And that's a big thing going on just now, man.
Just to follow Nicky up, 2 or 3 years ago now, Pike River in New Zealand,
Yeah.
and you always thought that New Zealand, and I can Rob, you've worked all over the world in mining, that there would be plenty clued up on health safety in the past. I mean, that explosion, the methane explosion, and all you seen was the police. They're waiting on the report for the police.
Yeah.
No mines rescue. Because we would always, if it was in here. And then I phoned John Simon, used to be a mine manager. John did a bit of research on it because he's getting it all over the world. And there wasn't an egress route, there was only one road in.
Single end.
One single end in.
Yeah.
No methane drainage. I mean, we, since after the war, methane, you worked in Cardown, they had methane drainage. And there was no methane drainage. So 29 people lost their life in an explosion. And I says to my wife, to Brett, I says that there'll be no bodies, they'll not recover any.
They've never got them.
And they've never got them, and they never will get them. And now they're talking about prosecute the company for negligence. But the 29 men, there was 2 Scotsmen amongst them, 29 men have lost their life. Actually, there was a young boy, Andy Hardy, he works in Australia now, but he was a young apprentice miner at Upton Hall, and it was private, And he went to New Zealand to work in that mine, and he wasn't feeling well, he didn't go to his work that day.
Yeah.
And he's still alive today, and working in the coal industry in Australia. And that, it would worry me like to go and work in that type of environment.
Yeah. And that's the ironic thing about it. If you look at it, and it's actually one of our former inspectors that's been taken over there, to look after or change it. The New Zealand government done exactly what our government are doing. It's calling it red tape and looking at legislation in the coal mining industry, and it virtually disappeared in New Zealand. And that's what we're saying to this government. We're saying to them, what about Turkey, all the HSE people? You can't do it. And if it, I mean, we even get a perverse argument from them about, well, but there might not be any coal mines left in 5 or 10 years. We're saying, well, why are you spending all this money changing it? Just leave it then if it's not going to affect it. You know, and that is a big, big worry, I think. But we are where we are. I think we've run over time. Sorry about that. Mirette's just reappeared, but we can't, unless she wants to say something quickly. Mirette, do you want to say anything, or are you? Right, that's fine. I know you weren't feeling too well. Is there any other questions to us three before we finish? No. Just thanks very much for your patience and for listening to us. And if anybody's got anything they want to speak to us personally, I'm sure we'll make ourselves available. So thank you, and thanks, Anthony.